well, welcome. We're delighted to have you. Welcome to Houston.
Thank you so much, Jose. It's good to be here.
Yes. We have a great group tonight. And let's start a little bit with your personal history.
Okay.
You were born in Lima, Peru. How do you go from there to being the renowned published author that you are today in the United States?
Oh my goodness, that would take 8 books to do. First, I want to thank the World Affairs Council, and thank you, Jose, for being part of it, and to Mayor Brown for funding it, which I didn't know. What a wonderful group the World Affairs Council is. This is I think my second time. I was here for my last book, Silver Sword in Stone. And it's such a pleasure. Educating the citizens of this country about global affairs is so important and so valuable to every single one of us. So thank you to the World Affairs Council. Thank you to you for volunteering to do this.
Happy to do it.
But my story, oh my goodness, you have to go back generations, I guess, to tell my story. My family in Peru is a family that has been in Peru for almost 500 years. They came in the 1500s, along with, I should say they date to the 1500s because I am part Spanish, part indigenous, also have, according to the DNA tests, part black, part Chinese, so I'm the whole mix, which, of course, Latinos are. We're going to talk about that later, I hope. But it starts with that. It starts with the fact that my Peruvian ancestors were there for a very long time in this hemisphere. My mother and father, my mother is Anglo-American, she's deceased. She met my father in Boston. My father was at MIT during the time of World War II. And when World War II emptied all the classrooms in the universities of young men, because they went off to war, the Department of State, the State Department, the United States State Department, brought young men, mostly, some women, mostly men, to fill those classrooms in the United States. And my father was the beneficiary of a U.S. State Department fellowship, I guess, to come and study at MIT, which he did, and got his master's there. He met my mother, who was a music student and a musician, performing musician in Boston, and she was going to the New England Conservatory of Music, which was right next door to MIT, and during the war, they were sharing a cafeteria. They met. And my father brought my mother down to Peru. My mother was an immigrant to Peru, and for many years before they decided to come to the United States. I was 10 years old. That's where it begins. So I was born in Lima, grew up on the coast outside of Trujillo in Peru, and then went to really was taught by my mother until the 4th grade. And then after that came to the United States and lived in Summit, New Jersey, and was bilingual, interested in the world at a very early age. And it was, I suppose, then that I became a reader. I was a books person before I was a writer. In other words, I was editing books, I was publishing books. I had a long career in publishing before I joined the Washington Post, became the books editor, and then was hired by the Library of Congress to be the literary director. So books were really what I was all about. And I decided at the Washington Post, the Washington Post was the first place that was ever interested in my being Peruvian. In the publishing houses, nobody cared. When I would try to bring a project, a Latin American project, to the editorial board meetings, they would say, oh, Hispanics don't read, no. And so we were really, my whole career was publishing everything but Latino stuff. And then when I went to the Washington Post, the editors there said, oh, you speak Spanish? We could send you out and interview some people. I said, well, I'm a books person, and I do books, and I was the editor of the books section. But I took the challenge and went out and started writing. And at that point, it occurred to me that the Americans just didn't know enough about this population. And at that point, when I had come, it was only a population of 2 million that the US Census was counting. Now it's a population of 64 million. So in my lifetime, this population has grown from 2 million to 64 million. And it's just a stunning fact. And I had written about Latin America for 7 books and then decided, no. This is a Latin America in this country. And in fact, it is the largest Spanish-speaking nation, Latinos are, outside of Mexico. The largest. So it's a remarkable fact, just in my lifetime, to have witnessed that. So that's the story of how I got from the beginning to this book.
Where you are today.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. Before we go into the specifics of your book, let's talk a little bit about terminology, just to understand what we're talking about. And this terminology is a terminology that is used from the United States to this group that you're referring to. You say that you use in your book interchangeably Hispanic and Latino. Are they really synonymous? Who is a Latino conceptually? And is there a difference between a Latino and a Hispanic?
It's all labels, in my view. The term Latino actually came from Napoleon. There was a point, of course, during the revolutions in Latin America, almost at the same time, just before that, Napoleon invaded Spain. And he looked around and he realized, my gosh, this is an extraordinary colonial empire that Spain has in this hemisphere. So they wanted to convince at that time, the viceroyalties of Latin America, that they had something in common with the French. So they used the term Latin, America Latine, and Latin became then the word that was used for Latin America, and it became, and in this country, it was adopted generally by the media, not by the people, the Latinos. Fast forward to 1970s, and Richard Nixon decides that he wants to create an electorate out of the Hispanics because he has known them. He grew up in California. His father was a grocer. He grew up actually working with the agricultural workers in the fields. So he knew the people, he knew the Mexicans and the Mexican Americans, and had grown up with them, and he didn't understand why they didn't vote for him. I mean, he was from that area of California, and so when he went for re-election, he decided he was going to create an electorate out of this body of Mexican Americans largely that he knew so well. And so he called them Hispanics. He created the Hispanic Heritage Month and Day. He brought Hispanics into the White House. He was actually astonishing sponsor and champion of Hispanics. Today, and then of course now we have Latinx, which was brought to us by the LGBTQ community and academics, really, who want to sort of de-genderize the word Latino and Latina. As I say, the media has adopted Latino, so I call my book LatinoLand because that is the predominant use of label that we have. But these are all labels that were imposed on us, and we didn't choose them. We didn't invent them. They were put on us, and we have accepted them. Hispanics, to me, are people who speak Spanish,
right, and
people of Spanish heritage. So that's what it means to me personally. Yeah. And Latino, I use Latino because we use America Latina, We use Latin America in Latin America now pretty regularly.
Yeah. Latino would cover the Brazilians that were a colony of Portugal, not Spain.
It should.
They consider themselves Latino. So to me, Latino is a little broader group than Hispanic from that perspective.
This is why the media uses it, I believe.
Yeah.
Latinx is used by only 2% of Latinos in this country, and so it's not really, people don't most Latinos and Hispanics do not call themselves Latinx.
Now, what would you do with the Cajuns in Louisiana?
Yeah.
Would you call them Latinos?
Yeah, exactly. And really, there are so many gendered languages. Russian is a gendered language. Japanese is a gendered language. So should we say I speak Russex, Russian X, or if you say it in Russian, you would have to genderize it, so nobody does that.
Okay, we'll include within Latinos the Brazilians, the Portuguese Americans, but we'll not include the French Americans.
Right.
For whatever reason.
For whatever reason.
The label hasn't caught them yet.
Yeah.
All right. Get into the specifics of your book with respect to LatinoLand. Tell us or remind us a little bit about how is it that by the time the United States was founded as a republic, and the territory of the United States obviously was the former territory of the 13 English colonies and no more at that time. Before then, there were already Spanish colonial settlements here. Way before the Jamestown settlement, there were Spanish here in what today is the United States for over a century. And so remind us a little bit about that fact and how is that the Spain had grown before the United States came into being.
This is one of the very big points of my book is the historical resonance. The Hispanics, Latinos were on this territory way long ago. The first Latino that I write about in LatinoLand was Cabeza de Vaca, who was a conquistador who actually lived. I say that he was a resident here because he was shipwrecked and lived here on this territory, traveling from Florida, walking all the way through to Texas, and then eventually returning 10 years later back into Mexico, where the conquistadores were. And he was imprisoned by the Native American tribes, quite a few of them, and he was a slave to them. And he became famous to them because he had special power. He had some basic medical knowledge. Living on a ship, you would need to know how to do wounds and that sort of thing. And he was really sort of seen as a mystic because he could cure people. Eventually, he went back to the conquistadores completely changed in his head because he had actually lived and been enslaved by the tribes and had learned a great deal about Native America. He was the first. And then there's a whole series because, of course, when the Spanish came up in the turn of the century, the first Oñate, the first expedition into this southwest area where you live, was in 1600, 1601. It was there were established settlements here. The Spanish eventually ruled all the way up to Colorado, Wyoming, and from California all the way to Kansas. And that huge part of this continent, which is almost 2/3 of the continent, was Spanish and was inhabited by the colonial Spain, which was a fusion of the indigenous culture and the Spanish culture. So Mexican Americans have a great heritage in this area. And it was from 1600 to 1848. By 1848, the manifest destiny, the westward hoe, had pushed west so much, and the Washington D.C. was saying, "Go take your stick, plant it in the ground, it's yours." when in fact it was Spanish, and it had been Mexican for a very long time. But that wave of westward ho, that press of what I think Americans are so proud of, that sort of wondrous coast-to-coast ambition, and was actually pushing Mexico back and pushing the Spanish out. Eventually, the push was so strong and so overwhelming that a lot of Mexicans had moved back to Mexico.
Yeah. So the first Latinos, is not that they came here. They were incorporated by the United States as the United States grew.
As they say, the border crossed them.
Yes. Yeah. That's interesting. So you say that Latinos are about 63 million people. When we look at somebody, sometimes it's hard to tell. This is not a racial or an ethnic denomination. So give us an idea as to racially or ethnically who can follow within the classification of Latino.
Yeah. Well, unlike the Pilgrims, the Anglo-American population that came and established the 13 colonies, there was no real difference. I mean, these were white Europeans in the 13 colonies. But for Latin America, as we know, the conquistadores came without women. So there was a mixed population right away. By the time that, even by the time that Mexico was conquered, or the Taino tribes in the Caribbean were conquered, and certainly by the time Pizarro went to Peru, very quickly thereupon, there was a mestizo population, and a very large mestizo. Mestizo means mixed race. And of course, 500 years of race mixing, because we had the infusion of the Atlantic slave trade, which came from Africa. And I think Americans don't realize that there were 12 million slaves that were captured and chained and put in vessels and sent to the Americas. Where did they go? 350,000 went to the United States, what was known as the United States, the colonies, and then the United States. Only 350,000. All the rest of those millions, 11 million, 1 million died, 350,000 went to the US, and all the rest, the 11 million, went to what is now Latin America. And so the infusion of the black race in us is strong. Then there was the infusion of the Asians who came, especially in Peru. We have a very strong preponderance of Asian population, and we mixed with them. Mm-hmm. So Latinos, this is a really interesting fact about Latinos. We're already mixed race, most of us, to some degree. Even if we say we're white, or even if we say we're black, we're actually mixed race, most of us. And so when we come to this country, the Latino population is the population that is most likely to marry into another race or another ethnicity. And so that mentality of it's okay is very much with us.
Yeah. So there are white Latinos, yellow Latinos, brown Latinos, black Latinos. Everyone. Because of that commonality aspect of the country of origin, if you will, mm-hmm. Qualifies as a Latino. Mm-hmm. And now, in your book, you describe several personal stories, because the border crossed the first Latinos. Now Latinos are crossing the border.
Right.
So we've had two different historical periods as to how the Latino population in this country grew. Right. In your book, you tell a lot of stories about those who came to this country once this country was fully configured as it is today, and harrowing stories in some cases. There is an appeal there. or a need to leave where they are from. So what's your take on it's either the magnet or the push or a combination of both that results in such large numbers of Latinos wanting to come to this country?
Well, it's also an echo of American policy. As we all know, in Latin America, the American policy in Latin America has been, and this is from the Monroe Doctrine, we are the guardians of this hemisphere. And it's written very clearly in the Monroe Doctrine. We are the guardians of the hemisphere. If there is any untoward action in the hemisphere, we will correct it. And that's stated very clearly. You can read it. It's right there in Washington, in the Library of Congress, where I work. And so the amount of interference, I mean, there's no question that that Peru interfered with the Chilean presidency when Salvador Allende's presidential palace was bombed. We all know now that it was the CIA who was helping that to happen. The American policy has interfered in Honduras, in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, in a big time. The very circle where we're getting most of the immigration now, that northern triangle of Nicaragua, Honduras, and Salvador, and Guatemala, yes. That we have, as Americans, interfered in their politics for a long time. We have created military bases there. We have reacted to commercial issues with political force, and mainly for extractive purposes. The whole banana wars, or the issue of extraction, or now the drug wars. I mean, this is what the CIA speak calls blowback. This immigration push that we have seen now, the waves of immigration, are almost a direct result of American interference in those countries. So, yeah, it's a very touchy political subject. And now, how do you fix it? How do you sort that out?
Yeah, that's a big challenge of the day.
Yeah, yeah.
You mentioned in your book that certain industries in the United States are mainly supported with workers, with Latinos, mm-hmm. and that if all those were to disappear, these industries would essentially become unviable. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is such a strong point. I published an essay in the New York Times, I guess it was about 10 days ago, that spoke directly to this. I mean, we tend to think of the border as being, the flashpoint, where everything is happening, and that's the story of Latinos, is what's going on the border, when in fact, it's not. The economy of the United States would not be what it is without the Latino population. Latino businesses are now the highest growth. I mean, the small businesses that are created in this country, the percentage of growth among the Latinos is 44% growth of Latino businesses year after year for the past 5 years. What is it on a national level? 4%. It's 10 times higher. Latinos are very, very strong in work ethic and in commercial success. They're more likely, even though they have a harder time getting funded from banks, they generally have to raise the funds themselves, more likely to create businesses than any other ethnicity in the country. If you were to take the Latinos as a nation, as a complete nation unto itself, it would have the 5th largest GDP in the world. Imagine that. So pluck that out of the United States, and what have you got? A kind of crumbled economy. This is the breadbasket of the country. This is most of the agricultural workers, most of the agricultural work comes from the Latino population. It is a tremendous economic force, and it's because the population is so invisible. I mean, we don't. And when I say invisible, we're not educated about the Latino population. We don't have it in our textbooks, in our school books. We don't know what their history is. We don't know, for instance, that the first admiral of the United States, who said, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, was a Latino, was a Hispanic. David Farragut was a Hispanic. His statue sits in the middle of Washington, D.C., and 5 blocks from the White House. His bust sits in the Army-Navy Club right there on Farragut Square. And we don't realize that this was, David Farragut was his father was Jorge Farragut, totally Hispanic. And so in the way that we don't recognize that, because we were never taught that in the school books, we don't recognize the political power, the economic power of the Latino population. So that's something I'll try to correct in this book.
Yeah. Talking about the political power, we're in an election year, and sometimes you hear pollsters or pundits referring to the Hispanic vote. Is there such a thing as a Hispanic vote? No. Okay, tell us about that.
No, there is no such thing as a Hispanic vote. There is no such thing as a total sort of mindset unity among Latinos, because we're very, very different, and we come from different perspectives, different mini cultures, shall we say. But assuming that there's what is the issue with the Latino vote is that we undervote. So I mean, basically, this is a population that keeps its head down and works. And they're not convinced that voting is going to get them very much of anything. There are places in Texas where you have an overwhelming Latino population, but only 17% of them go to the polls. So that has been seen as a tremendous opportunity to draft people either into the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, but you don't know which way they're going to vote. And the chances are, because Latinos are a spectrum, I mean, it's a more nuanced sort of, it's not a binary, it's not a red team or a blue team. It's very hard for us to think that way, because our issues actually cross. There are issues on the Democratic side that appeal to us, and there are issues on the Republican side. I was raised as a Republican, and I became an independent as a college student, and I have voted on both sides of the election choices. And this is not unusual for Latinos. I think that's mostly the case. But there is no fast and firm.
Yeah, there are not one bloc that votes the same way. A little bit same about religion. The assumption is they're all Catholic. They're not. So tell us about their religious makeup. We
were all Catholic at one time. When the Spanish did a very, very good job of promoting the Catholic Church. And under the flag of Catholicism, actually, a lot of the conquest was achieved. But lately, and it is because of the strife in Latin America, the political strife, has created, I think, a discomfort, a displeasure with the Catholic Church, because there was a point in the 60s which were very, very bloody in Latin America. The priests became politicized. There was what we call liberation theology. And during this time of liberation theology, the priests actually took up arms, because they said, well, we've got to help the people somehow, and we're not doing it here at the altar, so we're going to join the forces. And they went into the sort of revolutionary forces. And that created havoc, because this was a very, very bloody time. And I think a lot of displeasure was caused at that point. the evangelical churches, the Protestant evangelical churches, have been really, really doing strong recruitment in Latin America. Brazil is now 30% evangelical Protestant, which is stunning. I mean, the Latin America still is a bastion of Catholicism, but more and more the Latinos in this country are being evangelized. In the book, I spend a lot of time writing about this extraordinary pastor, Sam Rodriguez. Sam Rodriguez is a Pentecostalist. He has advised on both sides of the aisle. He was an advisor consultant to George Bush, George W. Bush. He was an advisor to President Clinton. He was an advisor to Obama. He was an advisor to Trump. And Sam Rodriguez is this extraordinary, has been an extraordinary apolitical person. But with time, I think he has realized that the Republican Party is actually more appealing to the evangelical mission. And so evangelicals are voting more and more on the Republican side because they are evangelicals. And the Latinos have been recruited in great numbers, great numbers. I think it's now almost 20%, more than 20%. A good quarter of Latinos are likely to be evangelical Protestants.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, I noticed that you were very animated on your music chapter.
Yeah.
So,
Mambo.
Latin music, what's on your playlist? And give us an idea of the wide spectrum and the origins of Latin music.
Well, they're everywhere. I mean, you know, you look into classical music, and you have classical musicians who are thriving. I mean, 8% now. I think it's 8% of classical musicians are Hispanic. A great deal more of them are popular musicians, jazz musicians. The infusion of the Latin beat has been. I mean, it's like tacos, right, or burritos. You find the Latin beat everywhere. You find it in hip hop. You find it in rap. You find it. I mean, rap and hip hop actually had Latino roots. And someone like Carlos Santana, who combines. I mean, he takes Caribbean sounds and mixes them with Mexican sounds and African sounds, and the result is a very distinctive sound. Latin music is everywhere. It's just everywhere now.
They trace African drums and Andean flutes, and all that over time makes up this very rich body of music.
Very distinctive sound.
Yeah. You highlight in your book people of accomplishment in different areas, Latinos of accomplishment in different areas, in business, in sports, in music, in education, in politics. Can you describe a little bit for the audience, or remind the audience who those people are, what they do, what are the accomplishments that can be highlighted?
They're really stunning accomplishments. The microscope that is in your doctor's office was developed by a Hispanic. He happens to what was her name? The hippie singer, what was her name? I forgot. Not Laura Nyro.
Joni Mitchell?
Who?
Joni Mitchell?
No, Joni Mitchell's a great choice, but it's Joni Mitchell's best friend, and I can't think of her. At any rate, her father is, who is it? Her father was a scientist, developed the microscope, the electron microscope that sits in your doctor's office, is a Latino. So much, the color TV, people, we don't know this. The color TV, the first prototype was made by a Latino. Of course, we have the NASA astronauts who are Latinos, and we don't celebrate them in any way. We have enormous achievements in both science and in culture. The Latino boom of authors now. I mean, you have Sandra Cisneros, you have Julia Alvarez, you have Juno Diaz, you have any number of great, American literature that's being produced by Latinos. And so there's a great presence and a great history. The military, the United States military, is filled with Latinos. A quarter of the United States Marines, 24% are Latinos in the Marine Force. A tremendous representation of Latinos in the military, and yet they don't get promoted high up because in the military world, it helps to be brought along, to have mentors, and the Latinos have not really reached the status of generals as much as they should have in terms of representation. I met the other day in Washington the Secretary of the Navy, who actually oversees the United States Marines, as you know, and he's a Latino. He is a Latino, and we haven't made enough fuss about him. I mean, we should be making a fuss about him. So we're represented everywhere. I mean, in every possible. One of the people I interviewed, who came as one of the Peter Pan shipments of children who were during the revolution, just after the revolution, 1960, 1963. 14,000 children were sent on their own, anywhere from 4 years old to 17 years old, from Cuba to Miami. And they were flown over without their parents. Some of them didn't see their parents for 4 to 5 years. Some of them didn't see their parents for 35 years. And they were brought over as children. One of those, many of those became successful. There are so many that were successful. But one of them became the CEO of AT&T. And I wrote about him in the book, too. This sort of tremendous generational leaps that Latinos make, which are really impressive. There was a neurosurgeon who was a grape picker and peaches. He was actually started in a peach orchard and became a grape picker in California. And his teachers noticed that he was particularly bright. And so he was helped along. He ended up going to Harvard Medical School and developing a brain surgery that is now seen as one of the most cutting edge of brain surgeries. He's a tremendously successful neurosurgeon.
You're referring to Dr. Palmaz?
No, this is Narciso Rodriguez, who is a Mexican who crossed the border when he was 14 years old, picked grapes, got noticed, and then has become this extraordinary neurosurgeon. There are great stories like this, and I love to tell them.
I first learned of Dr. Palmaz by drinking the wine he makes in California before I realized he invented the stent.
Yes, that's right. That's right. He was this, and he made it from a little chip of wood that he found lying on the floor.
Yeah. His winemaking operation is inside a mountain. It's a 5 or 6 story operation he has inside a mountain. It's quite a sight to see.
So he's working with wine barrels and pieces of wood, and that's
he has these little plots of land where he grows the grape, and they can be monitored centrally, and you can tell the differences in temperature and humidity, and
this is where the stent came from.
And this is the same man that invented the stent. He has this winery that produces this high-tech wine. He can't possibly sell it at cost because it will be prohibitive. So it's more of a hobby right now than a real business. Yeah. In business, business leadership, you referred to the person that was the head of AT&T, but in politics, representation in Congress, representation in the higher echelons of the executive branch. They're also in the judiciary now. We have a Latina member of the Supreme Court. There is also representation there, perhaps not in numbers that are proportionate to the size of the population, but nevertheless, there is representation, in running government through the different branches as well.
Yes, it's growing. The representation is something that is an issue, and is an issue that I discussed in this book very, very much so. There, Joaquin Castro, who is one of your representatives in Congress, has made a very, very strong campaign to convince not only corporate America. Corporate America has around 2% of the members of boards of major corporations in this country. Only 2% are Latinos. So you have 98% of the representation on boards, even though this, as I say, it has the 5th largest GDP in the world, this nation of Latinos, and is a great force in building commerce. Only 1 to 2% of boardroom directors are Latinos. And he has made a very big push to media companies, to newspapers, broadcasters, book publishers, Hollywood, this is a great flaw, that we don't see enough Latinos in those places and in just the public eye. And it's not unusual in a sense, because I think Latinos as a whole like to keep their heads down and work and just, this has been a real issue in the military. I've talked to so many soldiers who have said, no, I don't care about, the brass and all of this. I just, give me the hardest job, let me serve. And this is a sort of mentality that follows in corporate America as well. And now there is this strong campaign by virtue of these wonderful representatives like Joaquin Castro, who are trying to make a difference there. Say, have more representation in high places where you can see this population and appreciate its value to the country.
Yeah. Well, now we're going to move to questions from the audience. One problem for me is that all these questions have been written by a bunch of doctors. So I want to try to make the best I can out of what is written here. One question here is, are Latinos from the country generally concerned with the issue of, quote, equality in the way the black political class is? Or are they satisfied with the status from a political standpoint?
That is such an interesting question. Thank you very much to whoever wrote that. It's really interesting because the Democratic Party has always thought that we're the party for the Latinos. In fact, there have been politicians who've really stuck their foot in this by saying, well, I can't imagine why a Latino would ever want to be a Republican because, we're the party for you. And it's assumed that that whole notion of equality, diversity, affirmative action, it would appeal to Latinos across the board. But those issues are very, very sort of backroom issues for Latinos. Latinos really care about they care about the economy, number one. Can I have a job? Where can I work? Can I have two? They care about education. They care about security. Security is very, very important. They feel that, they're coming from troubled countries and will come to a place that's safe. This is why Uvalde was such a punch in the stomach, I think, was because you're supposed to be coming to a safe place when you come to America. So those are the issues. And when you come to diversity, equality, affirmative action, those are much more down the line for the great mass of Latinos. So that's a great question. Not as organized behind a an issue of human rights as the African American population of this country has been. And it is a model. I think the African American story is a model for Latinos in a way. But no, I mean, those issues of equality, diversity, or so just let me work. Give me a job, that sort of thing.
There is a related question here. What do you think is the origin of the negative stereotype or xenophobia against Latino or the Latino? What should we do to fix them?
Well, just yesterday I was in the White House watching a film that is going to be released soon, and it was a film that is being Joe Biden is working very hard now to capture the Latino vote. And so he invited a lot of Latinos into the White House yesterday to see this movie, which is specifically about the way that the racism against Mexican Americans particularly, and the racism that began so long ago with them, the racism that happens, there's much less of a racist question in New York with the Dominicans and the Puerto Ricans because they're such a part of New York in a way that I don't think the Mexican American population has become part of the Texan story, say, or the Arizona story, or the New Mexican story, in the same way that the Dominicans and the Puerto Ricans or the Cubans are in Miami, right? So for Mexican Americans, it has been a very, very difficult racial sort of issue. There was a time when veterans would come back from the wars, from the Korean War, from Vietnam War. They were decorated, they had Purple Hearts, they had Bronze Stars. They would come back and they wouldn't be allowed into a restaurant to eat. They would be kicked out with baseball bats. Their skulls would be crushed. They would be lynched. The restaurants would post very boldly, and maybe some of you will remember this because it was not that long ago, no Mexicans, no dogs. So the racism has been pervasive, and it has been a very difficult part of the Chicano, the Chicano sort of sense of unity was formed from that defense against the racism. But it never, even though the Chicanos are very strong, and the story is so appealing in a way because it's really sort of a motivating force, the Chicano identity. It hasn't really taken a strong position. It's almost as if we're not going to battle that. That's not our battle. That is not our issue. And at some point, it has to be, right? It has to be.
For every individual, yeah. This, in a way, touches on something that we have already discussed, but generally everyone believes Latinos are all one group. How can we educate non-Latinos to recognize that each country has its own culture and will carry different beliefs according to their history and culture?
That's also a great question, and it's a great question because nobody who comes to this country as a Latino, or even the Mexican Americans, think of themselves as Latinos or Hispanics. Nobody can, when I came from Peru, first of all, I came to a place in New Jersey that had no Latinos in it except my brother and my sister and my father. And so I was a Peruvian American. I was a Peruvian first, and then I was a Peruvian American, and I identified myself that way. I didn't call myself a Latino or a Hispanic or anything like that until the label was put on me. It was like, oh, you're Hispanic, you were born in Peru. So boom, you become one and you accept it. But none of us calls ourselves Latinos when we begin, when we arrive. This huge waves of population that arrive, they don't see themselves, that they're put in that category and they accept it. And interestingly enough, eventually we have friends who are across from countries that perhaps even our countries went to war with, you know. Some of your best friends are probably Chileans.
They happen to be,
right.
yeah.
Right, well, we had a war with Chile.
Yeah.
But that doesn't happen until you come to this country. And it's really interesting for me because having written a biography of Simón Bolívar, who liberated 6 republics in Latin America, all the way from the Caribbean coast all the way down to the Andes to Bolivia, his concept was, I'm going to take all these republics and I'm going to convince them to be one country. We're going to be one country because we were always meant to be one under this colonial rule, but now we're going to be one as a liberated force. And then we are going to be so strong, we're going to be a real contest against our northern neighbor. And so that was Bolivar's vision, which never happened. That Pan-American Union never really happened as he wanted it to be because the countries all got separated because Spain had wanted them to be separate so that they could control them more efficiently. So what happens, you come to the United States of America and you become a unified force, supposedly force, in the United States of America. You have friends across those lines and you recognize your similarities, your cultural similarities, even though you may not be able to define them. You feel comfortable with a Venezuelan or with a Chilean or with an Argentine or a Mexican. You just feel comfortable with them. It's, you're people.
Yeah, doesn't look like me.
No,
may not even speak the same language, doesn't have the same religion, doesn't vote like me, but we have something in common.
Yeah.
Figure that one out. I hope I'm going to be able to do justice to this question. In the book, The War of 1,000 Deserts, the author makes a case that the Mexico people in the 1800s were deserted by the Mexican government arming the presidios against Comanche raiding, which then led them to embrace the U.S. acquisition for security. Any thoughts on this view? This is obscure
that last
to me.
Part again.
Yeah. Maybe the questioner can help us clarify the question.
Yes.
Sir.
So, in the book, he talks about all of the, you were talking about so much of the geography of the Western United States were Mexican people, but the Mexico City government was basically ignoring them with political battles, and so as the Comanche, the indigenous peoples here in the United States, were raiding and stealing their livestock and, taking their children. And so this book was very fascinating to me because it said that when the Zachary Taylor went down to the Mexican-American War, that this article, and I can't remember the number in that treaty, was very important to all those people because they wanted security and they didn't care where it came from. And so it wasn't so much that the United States came in and we just conquered them and took everything. It was also this third aspect of the Comanche Indians and then what those people needed was security. And they still have that heritage. They still want to be here. They still consider it their home for hundreds of years. But I was just wondering what your thoughts were on it, about that theory or
that. Yeah. Well, that reminds me so much of the Latin American story in so many cases. This is not only Mexico, but down into Central America and down into South America too. The emotions were so undefined that you basically had whole populations fighting on one side until the other side was winning. And then it was basically an issue, as you say, of security, because you wanted to be on the winning side. And so they would run literally across a battlefield to join the other side when the other side was gaining on them. And it was because the issue was not whatever your tribe is. It's who's gonna make me safest, who's gonna win, and then I will be safe. And so it was really, really hard to actually muster troops that would be faithful to one side or the other because there was that fluidity at all times. But yeah, really interesting story. Thank you.
All right, that's it with the questions from the audience. So we're going to conclude the program thank you for being with us. Hope the audience got a good view on Latinos and LatinoLand and the story and your personal story, which is fascinating. So good luck to you.
Thank you very much.
Hope your success continues.